Plato, you know, the philosopher, not the fun putty, Plato, he had this theory of forms. And if you've never really delved into philosophy, right, you have Plato and Aristotle are kind of the both and, if you want, of philosophy schools. They're very different and yet very complementary. And of course, St. Augustine kind of baptizes Plato, and St. Thomas Aquinas kind of baptizes Aristotle, which if you study Augustine and Aquinas, you'd go, yeah, again, different but certainly complementary. But Plato had this theory of forms, and it was this idea that what you and I experience in reality is limited and not really the ultimate experience of that. That insert thing, this is a plant, but Plato would say it isn't really. It participates in plantness, but somewhere there is a perfect plant of which this is really just reflecting that perfect form. And you can see why Augustine, when he read that, went, oh, this is Jesus. This is so natural, you know, many years later to go, oh, wait, I know exactly what he's talking about. That there's a perfect form. But what we experience here isn't that, right? That's what he's driving at. And Karl Rahner, many years later, of course, made this very interesting statement about our experience of everything. He said, in the torment of the insufficiencies of everything that is attainable in this life, we come to learn that all symphonies ultimately remain unfinished. Man, that's deep. But if we don't acknowledge the limitations of what we can do in this physical realm, then we're always going to be disappointed. How would I say this? We cannot not disappoint each other in love, whether that's a married couple or friends or siblings or mom, dad to child. Think about that. We cannot not disappoint each other. We don't possess the ability because we're limited, we're finite, we're boring, we're dull, we're wounded. We bring all of our baggage to each and every relationship. And that doesn't mean then that we say, well, then I won't even bother. But we do acknowledge the form, we do acknowledge the perfect, and then how it gets lived out in the messy reality of our lives. And so when Jesus says what he says here, right, it's a trap. They're trying to trap him. But of course, he just goes back to Genesis. And where does he set the bar? Oh, at perfection. Where would you expect him to put it? God has always said, this is the perfect. And then God has always not required it of us because he made us. He knows our limitation. And so when we talk about difficult things like divorce, when we talk about ways in which we can hurt each other, even when we don't want to or don't mean to, I cannot count on infinite number of hands the times I've had conversations with adolescents, maybe in confession or just in conversation, to go, you know what, sometimes I say things to my parents that as they're coming out of my mouth, I don't even know where they're coming from. I said, yeah, and anyone who's been an adolescent goes, yep, it's part of that growing. And I don't know what it is, I don't know why it is, but I can say that I've seen it, I experienced it. And it represents that thing where I say, I want to honor mother and father, but man, sometimes the things that come out, I don't even understand where it's coming from. The form versus our experience, our reality. And so as we hear Jesus say this today, I hope we give ourselves permission. St. Francis de Sales once was making a very simple point that is a lifetime's work when he said, look, you learn to speak by speaking, you learn to study by studying, you learn to run by running, you learn to work by... No, he said, no, yes, working. And then he said, and you learn to love by loving. And he was writing this in response to someone to say, I don't know how to love God. You know, God's perfect and I'm not. And he just said, it's only through practice. Just this morning, I was having a conversation with one of my scholars in the Philippines, and it was a heartbreaking one. He had promised me going into this semester that he was going to earn the grades he needed to get a 100% scholarship so that he wouldn't have to take from our scholarship. He promised me that. And he didn't make it. In fact, worse yet, he got an incomplete, which in the U.S. is like, meh. Apparently in the Philippines, as I learned this morning, this is really bad. And so I spent a little time going, it's okay, it's going to be okay. You shot for perfection and you missed it. That's okay. And earlier this morning, I ran across a video clip of an NBA player where the reporter said, do you consider this season a failure? Anyone seen this? I don't even know who it is. He goes, oh. He said, Michael Jordan played 15 years in the NBA. He won 6 titles. Do you suggest that the other 9 years were failures of his life? There are a lot of goals in life, and some of them we hit and some of them we don't. But if you're just going to judge things by the ultimate, well, then a lot of things are going to be disappointment and failure. And in the end, what's so wrong about failure in and of itself if we learn from it? So as I said to my scholar, it's okay. It's okay. You just have to figure out what you're going to do now. And then he said something that really broke my heart. He just said, I'm not that strong. What? You are. And I think as that broke my heart, it breaks the heart of God when we don't give ourselves credit for what we're trying to do. That our desire to love God is indeed pleasing to God. Even if at the end of the day you and I look and go, well, that didn't work. That God is going, yeah, but you got this. You got this. You're worth it. You're exactly who I laid my life down for. Come to me. Let me touch you. You are not a collection of your failures. That we are defined by precisely our intention to do God's will. And so that's what I said when he said, I'm just not that strong. I said, but you're going to get strong by practicing strength and not being afraid to fail at it. We're a shame culture like many, but his is much stronger that way. But shame in the end, brothers and sisters, does not motivate us. We eventually call its bluff. The church tried it for many years. You do this or you go to hell. That's a heck of a threat, amen? That's a heck of a threat. But in the end, people call its bluff. I'm here today. I always have people, they say, why'd you become a priest? It was the most radical way to say thanks when I finally realized what God had really done for me. It was the most radical response to go, whoa. He loves me not in spite of my sin, but right in the middle of it. And he loves you, not because you're capable of perfection. Newsflash, you're not. And that's where a lot of our disappointment comes from, is our inability, I think, to start with that understanding. We're going to receive something very perfect from this altar. His presence. What a gift that he gives us. No one here has earned it. No one here is going to come worthily to receive the Eucharist. But he's offering it to each and every one of us to say, this is what you need. This is what you need to be strengthened. It's not magical. It doesn't make it magically easier to deal with all the things you're dealing with. All the hard relationships, the hurt relationships, the disintegration of relationships. But it is the medicine that our soul needs. And the more we come to it, the more we tap into this mystery, the form, if you will, to go, hey, how does that work? I can't just wrap my head around it. But I'm going to keep returning to it. As Francis said, you learn to love by loving, and you learn to sacrifice by sacrificing. And when we come together as a community to receive his presence, a sacrificed presence, hopefully it takes us to understand that. It takes us to the place to go, yeah, we want to be one. We want to be unified. We can't really be one heart and one soul in this world, right? That isn't possible. The two become one. We're all aware of those relationships. I said this a few weeks ago about the Eucharist, that our relationships are that way. You can say, I know someone, but I don't understand them, right? That's a different standard. I don't always understand. But here we find ourselves hearing this difficult reading. Only twice in the Gospels do the apostles pull him aside and go, what did you just say? This is one, and the other was his passion reference, where they pulled him aside and said, what are you talking about? This is the only two times that they pull him aside to go, I don't understand. Because this scared them as much as it might scare us. But I hope the insight around what God's asking of us today isn't to be perfect. He doesn't need us to be perfect. Jesus has already conquered that for us. What he needs us to be is faithful and humble and gentle of heart, with ourselves first and then with each other. So as we look out into a world that is just frothing with contempt, inside the church and out, that our response to that would be how God treats us, with mercy, with love, with a tenderness and a gentleness. Anything less is just fighting to fight. And I said last week, the devil does a dance. You're all worked up about that. That's sweet. It will lead to more and more disintegration. If what we want is unity, then we better start practicing it. And it starts today in this Eucharist. May God be praised.